Good morning and welcome to the Right Now Show. I'm Charlie Redner.
And I'm Judy Saxon. And this is a program where we put the emphasis on writers, writing, and the arts. And Charlie, you can tell from our intro clip that we're going to be talking about Heart Mountain today, the Japanese incarceration camp,
Yes.
And the Eagle football team that formed there, and learning
Well,
more.
I want to tell you, this is
period.
the third author we've had in 6 months talking about this topic and, Japanese internment. And, as a writer, sometimes you try to think ahead, can I catch a wave? But usually you can't. But in this case, it's one of the most topical topics that there is, at the moment.
I know.
And it's an important book, and this is a very important book, and I'm really happy that you wrote it because I think it's very much needed in today.
Absolutely. Well, we're delighted to have Bradford Pearson with us today, and he's written a book called The Eagles of Heart Mountain, a true story of football, incarceration, and resistance in World War II America. And let me tell you a little bit about Brad. He was the features editor for Southwest, the magazine. He has written for the New York Times, Esquire, Salon, Philadelphia Magazine, Cowboys and Indians, among other publications. He was the associate editor of D Magazine in Dallas. He grew up in Hyde Park. Welcome, Bradford.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
We are delighted. Where do we start? Wow.
I want to start with a book proposal. It's probably most interviews that Brad's done probably didn't do this, but we're talking to a lot of writers out here in our audience, sure. And we like to know how things get started. I know the way you found out about this topic. You can tell us that, but then I want to ask you about specifically the book proposal.
Sure. So I found the topic itself, the story of the Eagles specifically, I was on a freelance assignment for this magazine, Cowboys and Indians, back in 2013. I was on an assignment at Yellowstone National Park, and there was the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center, which is the museum where the former Heart Mountain camp existed, is right outside of the eastern entrance of Yellowstone. So one day I went there with some downtime, and I left the museum with, I went in with a certain expectation of how much I knew about this history. And I left being a bit embarrassed and floored by how little I knew. And at that time, I did pick up the story of the Eagles, and it sort of sat in my head, and I would think about it every 6 weeks or 6 months, and then a year would pass, but I just couldn't stop thinking about it. So I slowly started picking away a little bit at a time. This was when I was doing this, I was the features editor at Southwest's In-Flight magazine. So at night I would sort of go home and think like, okay, well, what do I want to learn about tonight? I need to figure out who these Eagles players are. And it sort of snowballed from there. And like you said about the book proposal, I started working on that in 2017. And a lot of people have actually asked, not necessarily in interviews, but personally, like, there's a lot, I included a lot of history in the book that's not just about the Eagles football team. And everybody sort of asks like, oh, was that the intention in your book proposal? And there's like about like that much of the history in the book proposal. But then when I started doing all the research, I realized that it was important for me to not only tell the story of this football team, but to tell the story of Japanese American life and the history that these players and their families and their ancestors had led before Pearl Harbor and before the camps, because I thought it set the proper tone and sort of let the reader, it gave the reader enough history to sort of say like, okay, here's exactly why this happened. And as opposed to it just being because of Pearl Harbor. So
I started to read your book on my phone, but I had also ordered the hardcover. And when it got here, I was so impressed. And the first thing I did when I got the hardcover was go right to the back. And I looked at the index and I saw how many pages you had there. And I saw your notes and I'm saying, my goodness, the research. I don't know if you hired a research assistant or not, but boy, you did a magnificent job.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
And I should mention that it was published by an imprint, Atria Books, an imprint of Simon and Schuster, not too shabby. How did that come
Thank
about?
you. Well, I've had a book agent for a while, even before this book project, but I never really found anything that either of us agreed would be something that I wanted to spend my years spend years working on. And so I came across this story, and I mentioned it to my agent, David, and he was like, yes, like that's the one, you need to go do that story right now. And then agent, David's great. And I worked with the book proposal on him, and then he sent it to lots of different editors and people in New York. And then basically, I think I ended up having 6 different meetings with different publishers and different editors. And I was really lucky. A lot of people don't get to write a book as their full-time job. And
Right.
I recognize that I was
Oh,
incredibly
right.
lucky. I was incredibly lucky to be able to sort of spend the time that I needed to learn all this and to research this really thoroughly. And that was because, I have a good agent. And I think that all these publishers saw the value in the story, and in terms of it being the kind of story that a lot of folks don't know about. And
Yes.
so
Right.
then again, it was lucky, and I teamed up with a great editor at Atria. His name is Rakesh Satyal, who is a writer himself, and we sort of saw each other, and I think both of us liked what we brought to the table, and that's how the Simon & Schuster and Atria pairing came
Wow.
about.
And how long would you say it actually took to write it, including all of that research?
Oh my goodness. Yeah. So I started working on it again in maybe the spring of 2017, even just working on the book proposal. So at that point, you're kind of weighing, like, how much research do I do? How many interviews do I do? How much money do I sort of put into this myself in terms of reporting trips, without even knowing that you're going to
Recoup it.
recoup it or to get a book deal.
Right.
And I just sort of bet on myself and said, okay, I think if I work really hard at this, I'll be able to get a good book deal. So I started working on it in 2017 while I still had a full-time job. And then I ended up selling the book to publishers it was Valentine's Day of 2018 as when I had all my meetings. And then I started on it full-time May of 2018. And the first couple months, I just sat on the couch and read all day. So I would read books, newspapers,
want to ask you
oral
that,
histories.
Brad,
Yeah.
in your book proposal, one of the things they always look for is what other books are out there, and why is your book important or better than the other books that are out there? Did you have an answer to that?
I didn't have an answer, but it's interesting because that is part of the book proposal, where it's really hard to kind of say, because you want to like say that you're at this level of, whatever books you
Right.
think your book is similar to. So I remember talking about Hidden Figures and The Boys in the Boat, which were 2 books that I loved, that I looked at and said, like, oh, here's interesting ways that these 2 folks have told these stories in a way that brought these characters to life. But then there's also another book that I think is a little less known, especially in the United States, there's a writer named John Valiant who wrote a book called The Golden Spruce. That's it's ostensibly about this one guy who goes kind of manic and cuts down this centuries old spruce tree in Canada. But it sort of talks about all these different things that he hangs off the main narrative. So whether it's about logging or indigenous history and all these different things. So I looked at that book and said, like, this is a book that I think if I can use the main narrative of the football team, I can add all this other history to that. And that book did a good job of that. So I thought that was like a reasonable target in terms of, like, because The Boys in the Boat and Hidden Figures are both like massive bestsellers. So you can't say.
And how many people knew that there was a football team at any of these incarceration camps? And the daughter of one of the football players, Babe, was a tremendous help to you with your research, it sounded like.
100%. Yeah, I think that was what originally drew me to the story, was that I as soon as I learned about it, I was like, somebody has to have written about this before, and every journalist always thinks, like, when they get that sort of light bulb go off, that thinks like, oh, I need to learn more about this. And then when they find that no one's written about it, it sets off all these bells that you say, like, oh, I need to dedicate myself to this.
Yeah.
And, and again, like, that sort of bell kicked off for me because it was, you don't think of, first of all, as a person who grew up in New York, I didn't know much about this history in general. And then secondly, when you're learning about it, you're like, okay, so there were high schools at these camps. And not only are there high schools, there were high school sports teams. And not only were there high school sports teams, but there were high school sports teams that were really good. And it was on football. It was like all these combinations of factors that for me just made it seem, that's what they say, like the best nonfiction reads even sort of odder than fiction, because
Right.
it's like all these sort of circumstances coming together. So for me, that was really the thing where I was like, okay, I can't believe no one's written about this. And I spoke to the people at the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center and I said, this is a project I'm interested in working on. Could you guys help me in terms of just finding the source materials and newspapers and things? And they were really gung-ho and have been super helpful for years about this. And then to your point, Jan Mori, who is one of the main characters, Babe Nomura's daughter, was the first person I reached out to out of any of the family members or the living players, because I knew that Babe was the best player on the team. And I knew that without knowing his story, the book wouldn't matter. It wouldn't have been a good book if I didn't have the sign off from all these different families and help from these families, not just from a factual standpoint. The story itself wouldn't have been as good, but I would have felt, it's not my story to tell. So I wanted to make sure that I reached out to all of these families and that they were at least hopefully supportive of the project. And if not, if not, Jan opened her house to me. I stayed at their house when I would do my research in LA.
Wow.
And Jan was great in a lot of other ways too, in that she's a docent at the Japanese American National Museum in downtown LA.
Oh,
So she was able to sort of, so it was an incredible connection on a personal level because the characters in the book, but then also on a research and archival level, she was able to sort of steer me and say, like, oh, here's somebody that you might be able to talk to at the museum, or just sort of helped grease the wheels. Because I did some of my interviews at JANM when I was in LA, and even just sort of taking the time to walk through their archives and saying like, oh, Jan will vouch for him.
Where did you find the courage to write about this when you're not an Asian, not a Japanese? Did that interpretation at all come to mind?
Oh yeah, still every day, still to this day, even though the book's out, and I think we're in a moment right now in American history where folks of certain groups are encouraged to tell their stories of their family and their cultures. Right. And knowing that when I came to this story, I knew that I had no connection to the story. Not only I didn't have a personal connection, I didn't have a historic connection, I didn't have a familial connection. So I knew that going into this, I was going to have to be really diligent, and then also recognize that these families and this community had sort of opened themselves up to me, an outsider, and they sort of welcomed me in. And I knew that I really had to do a lot of work to make sure that I honored that commitment that they made to me. It wasn't just me saying like, oh, I'm going to write about your family. They said, we're entrusting our dad or brother or uncle's story to you because we trust you. So that was stressful a lot of times, but it's one of those things where it just made me work really hard. It made me know that like I needed to know all of this history backwards and forwards so that I could sit there and type it confidently and not constantly be second guessing myself. It made me be really diligent with fact checking and making sure that I knew all these family stories backwards and forwards. So I think in the end, that stress and anxiety drove the project forward and helped in a way. Yeah.
Well, tell us how it all came about. I know you've been asked this before, but tell us how it all started.
I may interject here, Judy. I feel I had made notes on this too and felt that it may have all started with the press, Brad, for the, that people started to write about this before it became what it did. And we had some people, we had Walter Lippmann and this Henry McLemore starting to write some very vitriolic conversations with the world by just the Hearst publications. I mean, wow, it sounds like possibly they actually got that ball rolling to begin with.
Yeah, it was actually kind of interesting when I started doing my research, because we always think about Pearl Harbor as like this precipitating event that led to the camps. Right. And in doing the research, I really wanted to show how much the decades before Pearl Harbor too had to do with this in terms of the way that the politicians, newspapers, and farmers were teaming up against Japanese and Japanese Americans and Chinese Americans
Right.
for the decades leading up to Pearl Harbor. And then sort of Pearl Harbor allowed them to finally have an event, and that seemed like an excuse to say like,
Yep.
oh, we've wanted to, get rid of Japanese and Japanese Americans for decades. Now we have our chance.
Mhm.
And I think you're right that folks like, you look at someone like Walter Lippmann, who was one of the most respected columnists and writers of his day,
Mhm.
Pulitzer Prize winner and
Yes.
Presidential Medal of Freedom. And, posthumously he received that. And you look at that and you just say like, they were just wrong. They spent so many column inches and so much time saying that the Japanese population here in the United States was a danger to white Americans and our way of life. And it just flew in the face of fact. It flew in the face of intelligence reports from the Navy, from the Army, from the FBI. It flew in the face of all of these things. Honestly, it flew in the face of what people's neighbors were saying about their own Japanese American neighbors. But again, and I do think that sort of disinformation from columnists, but also from the front page of the Los Angeles Times,
Right.
would also run stories that were ran a little fast and loose with the facts that sort of led people to, because right after Pearl Harbor, specifically, folks were pretty cautious, and folks said like, okay, we need to care for our neighbors that are Japanese and Japanese American. And pretty soon the press just sort of piled on, and public sentiment just flipped 100%. It did a full 180 and went from protecting their neighbors to thinking that they were in danger every time that they were near a Japanese American neighbor. And it was, and again, a lot of that was because of the press, and the press would do something and then that would go to the politicians, and the politicians would ping pong it back to the press. And it just became this echo chamber that eventually, led to the removal of 120,000 folks of Japanese descent.
Right. Oh my. And so what precipitated your getting involved in it to say, I want to write about this? Because it's true. I think so many of us really don't know much about it. And I learned much from your book, just what you were saying just then. I had no idea all that was taking place before Pearl Harbor. So.
Yeah, I think for me, I learned about that story. I learned about the specific narrative of the Eagles football team being really dominant. And I thought, oh, that's something interesting. But for me, a lot of it was sort of writing my own education. I did AP US history. I minored in history. You think you have a certain base level of knowledge about your fellow Americans and the things that they've gone through. Right. So for me personally, it was knowing so little about this. And again, being a bit embarrassed by how little I knew as someone who's reasonably well educated. I sort of took on this book and thought, okay, if I can write this book in a way that is engaging and exciting, and I can write this history as a white guy, maybe that's actually part of it. It might actually serve as a benefit in terms of it getting into the hands of different kinds of people who might not, unfortunately, might not pick up a book that's about these camps without the football or the World War II hook to it.
Right.
So
there are courses now on this book. You realize that in Montana, and if it's not the textbook for a lot of universities, I don't know what would be, because it's perfect for that.
It should be.
Yeah. I appreciate that. I've talked to a couple high school classes so far too. And again, it's one of those things where I thought that I tried to be a little sneaky about it, and that it was like, if I could convince people to pick up a book about football and World War II, then maybe I can convince, maybe I could teach them about all this other part of US history that maybe they don't know about.
Yeah.
Did you have a working title?
This was it. This was the working title.
Really?
Yeah, I knew sort of right off the bat that this is what I wanted to call the book. Okay. My editor, agent, publisher, they all knew. We had to work on the subtitle a lot. That went back and forth a lot, because I wanted it to be a lot shorter, but then they wanted to put more information in. And how
about Japanese in America from 1845 to 1945? I mean, there it is.
And that was the thing where it was like, I think the first, I'm trying to remember. So it was the Eagles of Heart Mountain, and it was football and resistance in an American concentration camp. And Simon and Schuster was like, I think we need to tweak it a little bit.
Yeah.
So then we ended up settling on this after a lot of back and forth. And I'm happy with the way it
Yeah.
turned out. And it was one of those things where, and I get into this a little bit in the book, that most people and most generations of folks use this term internment and Japanese internment. And I tried to, based on the terminology that folks use today, I steered away from that terminology, but that would have been a very easy thing to put on the title, to put in the subtitle, that some of the folks at the publishing house wanted to, but I had to push back and say, like, no, like, I really believe that we shouldn't include that, and that words matter here. And this, especially in, the book coming out in 2021,
Right.
and I couldn't, I couldn't have predicted the world that it got dropped into when I first started writing it. So I'm really glad that we settled how we did with the title and the subtitle.
Well, tell us about Heart Mountain. Describe that, the landscape and what they found, these people that were torn from their homes and those that were placed. And of course you write about Mountain primarily, but tell us about that, what they saw when they got off the train.
Yeah, so Heart Mountain, for those who don't know, is in Northwest Wyoming. It's in between two small communities of Cody and Powell. And it's a part of Wyoming that's so desolate and removed from the rest of the state of Wyoming that when they're originally platting the western states, everybody just thought it should be part of Montana. Like, it's disconnected from the rest of the state of Wyoming. It's been passed over for permanent settlement for millennia. This part of the Bighorn Basin has never had permanent settlement before, much longer than before the camp was there. Nobody had ever permanently lived where the Heart Mountain camp is. And that's in part because the winters were just blindingly cold, with wind chills could get down into the negative 20s and 30s. And the summers could get just as hot, over 100 degrees. So you have, 150 degree of temperature swings over the course of a year. There's very little vegetation other than scrub grass and greasewood and sort of the dotting, the low shrubs that have adapted to the climate there. And then they just decided to drop 12,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans into this one piece of land. And Heart Mountain itself sort of sits in the distance there and is this anomaly that geologists have been trying to figure out for decades, in that that what they believe, because when they started doing geology, when they started doing research on the mountain, they figured out that the top of the mountain is older than the bottom of the mountain. So nobody could ever figure out how this mountain, this oddly shaped mountain, came to be. And I think the current thought is that, however many million years ago, the mountain kind of got thrown from Montana and slid 100 miles into where its permanent location. So it's just a very odd place. And then especially, most of the folks who were in the Heart Mountain camp were from LA County. So imagine going from LA County, where you've probably spent your entire life and it's maybe never gotten below freezing, all of a sudden dropped into middle of Wyoming, where for some folks, 2 weeks after they showed up was the first snowfall in September. And most of them had never seen snow before in their lives. So they don't have the proper clothing. They don't have the housing they put up every barrack in less than an hour.
Good grief.
They would run out of coal. They would run out of coal. So it's just, imagine the worst case scenario for where, if you were pulled out of LA County, and other than Alaska, getting dropped into the northwestern Wyoming wilderness is probably close to one of the worst places you could go.
Yeah.
And they moved into these barracks, and all they had was, I guess, the bunks, the army bunks, and they didn't have any furniture. They didn't have any. It's. Nope. And they had to stuff paper in the cracks in the wood so that they could keep warm one hot stove somewhere. It's got to be incredibly difficult and hard.
And all they could take with them was what they could carry and on their back, right? What they could carry.
Yeah, they were allowed one bag and what they could carry. So basically, imagine stripping your whole life down to just however many pairs of pants, shirts, shoes, whatever heirlooms you were allowed to bring, because sometimes they weren't allowed to bring things that were in Japanese or Japanese records or Japanese things in Japanese print. So all those sort of heirlooms, just hopefully you had a trusted neighbor that you could leave them with in LA. But for a lot of folks, their lifetimes of memories were just thrown away or left on the curb in Hollywood or Van Nuys or wherever they were having to catch the bus to the train to camp for. So
Wow. Oh my. And they had to sell, some of them just sold their property for pennies on the dollar. I think in one interview you said, I think it was George from Mountain View, the football player, his family, did they own a strawberry farm and they sold it and now it's worth
yeah,
anyway.
no, it's basically they had a strawberry farm in Mountain View. So when you think about, when you buy a new iPhone, the first thing that pops up, it says like the weather is in Mountain View, California, because it's where Apple is. So you think about the land there and what the value was when they had to sell it because they had to leave within the week to get on a train to go to camp. And they sold this strawberry farm. I think it was about 50 acres, and they sold it for a price now that would be roughly about $60,000. And in today's dollars, it's millions of dollars for every acre. So, and that's just the tax assessed value. Because I remember one day I tried to figure out where it was, and then I plotted it all out based on, because Microsoft, it's basically the same land that Microsoft's Silicon Valley campus is on. So
oh my.
it's
Priceless.
literally now you look at it like what the difference in the inflation and what those land costs are now. It's pretty heartbreaking.
Given a week's notice. Is that right? A week's notice.
Yeah, it depended on where you were. So some folks the very first people that had to leave were in Bainbridge Island, Washington, and they only had a couple days. Some folks had 72 hours. Some people had a week. It depended on how, it basically depended on the sort of capriciousness of the army and the local folks who were rounding them up. So yeah, it's, think about all the things that you would have to do this week to get ready to.
I can't think about it.
Have your whole life pulled from you. Yeah.
I just can't. No. So let's get into a little bit about how life developed there on Heart Mountain and how the football team came into being.
Yeah.
Yeah. So once camp opened, right out the bat, the folks that were there, Heart Mountain immediately, after only being open for a few weeks, became the third largest city in the state of Wyoming. So there's that says two things: that the camp was really big, but then also that Wyoming was just that underpopulated that this one community of 11 or 12,000 folks became the third biggest city in the state. But because of that, things that came along with it, they had a hospital, but then beyond that, it was, especially that first fall, in the fall of 1942, there was very little for anybody to do because everything had happened so quickly. The federal government had removed them so quickly and with such little planning, such poor planning, that when they showed up, there was nothing to do. The school wasn't being held. They didn't have a school to put the thousands of school age kids in. So school was being held in people's barracks. So they were getting cleared out of barracks so they could host school in it.
Wow.
Eventually they built a high school, but again, there was nothing to do. So it sort of fell on the incarcerees themselves to figure out. So they started intramural sports pretty quickly. And then pretty soon after that, the WRA, which was the authority that had the authority over the camps, realized that we're going to have a lot of trouble on our hands if we don't allow some level of self-government and some level of autonomy here, even if they're behind barbed wire. So they started a community government, and that sort of forced the hand of the WRA to allow for different sort of classes. So pretty soon there were language classes, there were accounting classes, there were kabuki dance, there was calligraphy, and basically it was because all the incarcerees figured out we need to make the most of our situation here because no one else is going to help us. So it was sort of an industriousness there that everybody came together and made the barracks nicer and fixed up the barracks. And they would take old fruit crates and turn them into furniture. And they would, because you look, the barracks had many, many apartments in them all in a row. And so the noise would travel over top of every wall that wasn't walled up all the way to the ceiling. So people would try to put up curtains to have some level of privacy. It was just outhouses and latrines. So everybody in the middle of the winter, when it was, a blinding -20 and snowing, people would just leave pans in their house and buckets so they could use the restrooms. They didn't have to go out in the middle of the night. It was, think about as, depressing and desolate of a situation as you can. And that was the situation they were dropped into, but really tried to pretty quickly make the most of it because they knew that no one else was going to come and help them.
One of the things that they did, I guess, when the weather changed was they were into farming. So they started to grow their own food because they didn't like what the Army was serving them.
Yeah, I mean, the Army basically was serving hot dogs and powdered milk and potatoes and all these foods that, especially in the early 40s, weren't part of a regular Japanese and Japanese American diet. Right. So the one thing when they realized pretty quickly was that, okay, most of us are farmers or work in agriculture. So let's figure out what to do with this soil to make it actually arable. And they did that, and they actually finished an irrigation project that Buffalo Bill Cody had tried to start decades ago, which is why the city of Cody was named the way it was. So, but he failed. And then these folks from LA County and up and down the West Coast end up there. And to this day, if you go out there to where the camp is, there's still, all the fields are still arable now because of the irrigation system that was created by the incarcerees at Heart Mountain. Wow. So it's pretty green landscape now. And there's lots of, it's still mostly like hay and sugar beets, but the years that they were in the camp, they would grow Chinese cabbage, daikon radishes, squash, peppers, tomatoes, all kinds of things to make their diet, because their diet was still, the diet of folks in camp there was still mostly vegetarian based on their Japanese heritage. So, and their farm was so fruitful that they're actually able to send some of their vegetables to other camps.
Wow.
So they filled up other trucks and would send it to Topaz or to Tule Lake or some of the other camps, to Gila River. Yeah, they were in the farming system. There's whole books that have just been written on the agriculture in these camps, because it was so incredible under the circumstances that in just a couple of years, they're able to create these amazingly fruitful, no pun intended, these amazingly fruitful camps.
Now, the high schools, were they actually accredited? The high school that they would start, the high schools on the camps, how did that work? Or were they recognized by California? They were.
Oh, yeah. Good. Okay. It was actually kind of, it was obviously a very complicated system in that when the kids first got to camp, there was no high school. They had to sort of petition the state to get teaching licenses for the people in the camps. And even then, if you got a teaching license in the camp and you were of Japanese descent, your teaching license had a stamp on it that said only to be used in Heart Mountain. So they would give them, and I mean, there were people with PhDs from Cal who were teaching high school science there just because they knew that the kids weren't getting a great education. Right. They eventually lured some teachers with good pay from Nebraska and Wyoming and Colorado to teach there. But that was sort of few and far between. And the teachers would leave pretty quickly once they realized that they were like, I'm in the middle of nowhere.
Living in a barracks too.
Right. The money's good, but it's not great to be out here. But then even when one of the big issues was high school transcripts, like kids were getting pulled from schools in LA and Seattle and sent to Heart Mountain, and their transcripts would show up weeks, months, years later. So they would just have to sort of guess where to place these kids. So some kids got put in classes that were ahead of them. Some kids got held back for no reason other than they just didn't have a transcript. So especially high school, elementary school kids fared a little bit better, but the high school kids were really in a bind because some of them were some of them were at the best schools in major metropolises up and down the West Coast, and then got sent to essentially a rural farm high school. And there was one person that I interviewed, and I didn't include it in the book because I couldn't find a second source, but there was one interview that I did with one of the players' wives who also grew up at Heart Mountain. And she said that there were some teachers that were barely literate. They were just pulling anybody in that was white that seemed like an authority figure to teach them. And they would get paid almost 10 times the rate that the Japanese and Japanese American teachers were paid.
Oh my goodness.
Oh my.
Back to
Well,
the football a minute, Judy. I wanted
Sure.
to talk about you.
yeah.
There were only what, 3 players that had any experience at all. And tell us about the kind of team that they were able to build around these 3 guys.
Yeah. So, getting back to my point about how they had to sort of figure out things for people to do in camp, this is especially true for high schoolers, because there was nothing. If you were 16, 17 years old, you couldn't, a lot of these folks had grown up in Hollywood and LA. You couldn't just, go down Santa Monica Boulevard anymore. So
No.
they started figuring out that high school athletics might be a way to give these kids something to do and give them a goal and give them, something to spend their afternoons doing. And after the first fall was 1942, and then by the fall of 1943, football in the state of Wyoming was huge then, and it still remains huge in to this day. So they sort of were just like, let's find as many athletes as we can. So let's find baseball players, let's find pole vaulters, let's find track stars, let's find all of these different people and hope that we could put together a team of athletes that ends up allowing us to at least be a little bit respectful on the pitch.
These full
and they're
11-man
also
teams, both
Yep.
sides. I mean,
Yeah.
Wow.
11 man. And, a lot of that, that first season especially was driven, and we brought him up earlier. There's a player named Babe Nomura, and he was a starting running back at Hollywood High School before he got sent to camp. So you have a player who was playing at one of the most important positions, especially at that time in football, at a huge LA high school. So he got on the field and basically just told everybody else, just get out of the way. Just let me take the ball, and we'll figure out
halfback or
how.
quarterback.
He played both. So he would quarterback, and then he would play halfback. And they, because back then the backs would sort of switch in and out, and that actually ended up being one of the Eagles' main successes, was that they would just rotate players in and out of positions. So when they were playing all these white high schools from Wyoming and Montana, they didn't really know what to expect from the Eagles. They didn't know who the key players were. They didn't know who to expect to get the ball in a certain play. And I think they used a little bit of that deception to their advantage.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. And I read they had cardboard for pads in their thighs.
Oh my goodness.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because, and that was the thing that, not only did the WRA not really want them to be doing anything, especially anything that could be seen as Japanese, but they also gave them very little funds to actually fund the things that they allowed them to do. Mm-hmm. So the school itself, the high school glee club and pep bands and things, had to have fundraisers just for the football team to get any sort of padding, or to get helmets, or to get balls. And then that first year, especially, they didn't have money for thigh pads. So they would just use old cardboard and shove it down their pants and tape it up. And it's, especially when you think about it, it wasn't a grass field. They're playing on dirt and rocks in the middle of Wyoming. So it wasn't an easy fall every time they took a hit.
Oh dear.
Were they smaller in stature than most of the high school kids from Wyoming? But were they fast? What was the advantage?
Yeah, that was that. They were much smaller because, and I had to think about a way to sort of write about this delicately in the book. But at that point, there was most of the players there were only second generation. And that meant that they were still eating very little dairy in their diets. Japan itself has very little dairy, very little meat. So they were still eating mostly sort of an agricultural agrarian diet of vegetables and tofu. So these players were just, on average, were probably about 135 pounds.
Wow.
Most games they were outweighed by 30 or 40 pounds a man. And I think that in the end, they figured out a way to use that to their advantage. They said, okay, we're smaller, but we're a lot faster than these other guys. And if we can just sort of keep running and run these guys off the field and just stay in better shape, I think we'll have a chance. And the thing is, at that point, we don't think about it today in today's football game, but at that point, everybody was still playing both sides of the ball. So everyone was playing offense and defense. So if you could run somebody around and run them ragged on offense, they were going to have to do the same thing on defense. There's going to be the same men. So even if they're rotating out, these guys were still going to be tired. So the Eagles used that to their advantage in terms of they spread the field pretty well. And then they used a lot of end arounds and trick plays that helped negate the fact that they were a lot smaller than their players. And, football then, for the most part, especially in Wyoming, was this really smash mouth, run the ball, just try to force the ball up to the next 10 yards and hope that eventually you score a touchdown. And the games were, 7-6 or 9-3, and were very low scoring. And the Eagles just came out and said, we're going to play a totally different style of football. We're going to spread the ball wide. We're going to run as fast as we can and put up a lot of points and try to keep up with us.
So how did the team do overall in their best years?
So they played 2 seasons, and they only ended up playing 7 games in the entire existence of the camp. And I won't give the end of the book away for folks who haven't read it, but they won most of their games. And I will say that the final game is very important to the climax of the book.
Okay.
And
well, of course.
But that's the thing, like they're very successful. And that's the thing that sort of set them apart and made this book interesting to me to do as a story, is that they didn't just, this high school football team didn't just exist. They really dominated, especially the local Northwest Wyoming and Southern Montana teams, and really ran them off the field. And that to me was always so interesting, that it was, these kids, a lot of them were, again, 130, 135 pounds going up against these farm boys from Wyoming, and really just beating them literally at their own game.
And their best sport probably would have been baseball, and they had very little knowledge about American football, if you will, or even soccer, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, definitely.
No, go ahead.
What were we gonna say?
Oh,
yeah. And that's
yeah. No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, baseball, sort of grew up on this parallel track in Japan as it did in the United States. So even the first generation of Japanese immigrants knew baseball well. But football was a totally different sport, and nobody who came over on that first generation really understood football. So some folks started playing it, but it wasn't until they started having kids and those kids started going to high school that Japanese and Japanese Americans really started playing football in bigger numbers. There were some leagues up and down the West Coast of first generation, but American football itself was not on most Japanese people's radars, especially when they first arrived here.
Right.
And in another interview that I saw that you did, you talked about Babe, what an athlete he was. I mean, you did all that background on him. He was outstanding from the time he was a youngster in sports.
Yeah. Yeah. From a very young age. And Babe, his real name's Tamatsu, but he got the nickname Babe. He was the youngest kid in his family, and he watched his older brothers growing up and just sort of came to just be this really physical and athletic kid. So whether it was basketball, baseball, softball, track, and then eventually he sort of came to the football field. But that was kind of after he had exhausted all of his other avenues in terms of dominating, especially in LA at that time. There was a group called the Nisei Athletic Union, and that was for all second generation Japanese American kids. So even from the time he was 14 or 15, he was playing in all-star games against 25 and 26-year-old players from across Southern California. And for him, I think that was really influential in how good he became as an athlete. And by the time he got to high school, that was when he decided that he was like, okay, now I'm going to try my hand at football and try to dominate that as well.
And another thing I was so interested in your book, 5,000, they would have, for their football team, they would have 5,000 people in the audience. I mean, they didn't have bleachers, but they would be standing, 5,000 people watching these games.
Yeah, it was incredible, and a lot of the reason that I have all these details is because the camp had a newspaper called the Heart Mountain Sentinel that was a weekly newspaper, and it was incredibly thorough, especially when it came to the football team, in describing not only the games and not only sort of the box scores and the X's and O's of each game, but the crowd. So it would explain how many people were there, whether there were kids selling soda, what the weather was like, and it really, all of those stories were incredibly helpful in building each of those individual games out. And, that's the thing we have to think about. If you're, there's 11,000 people in this camp, 5,000 people is like half of the city showing up to watch this game. And that just shows, it shows that there wasn't that much to do in the camp.
No.
But B, they were also really dedicated to these kids and dedicated to the outcome of these kids winning and putting on a really good show, even beyond the athletics. It was entertainment too.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
You want to talk about
That's
what
wonderful.
happened when the American government decided that maybe some of these young men would like to fight for their country, America, and institute a draft that would affect them?
Yeah, that was for me, that was one of the more eye-opening parts of this book, was in terms of doing the research, was realizing that pretty quickly after the camps opened. So the camps opened in the summer and fall of 1942.
Mm-hmm.
By the spring of 1943, the government was already trying to figure out ways to get the young men from the camps to volunteer for the army. And
Mm-hmm.
that effort failed pretty spectacularly at most of the camps. So then the federal government said, like, okay, well, now we're just going to draft the young men out of these camps, which kind of made my head hurt a little bit in thinking about the sort of moral and mental gymnastics one has to do to declare that these young men are a danger to living at their homes on the West
Mhm.
Coast, but are also necessary to win the war in Europe. So these folks, especially in Heart Mountain, a lot of the young men sort of created this draft resistance movement, and they created a real movement that spread to all of the other camps that said, we are proud Americans that have been forced to live behind barbed wire. If you release us from the camps, we'll gladly join the army. We'd love to join the army. We are, dedicated, loyal Americans that have been put into this situation by my government. But we're not going to fight for a war that when we leave and fight, our sisters and our brothers and our parents and our grandparents are still going to be held at this camp away from their homes.
Exactly.
And the federal government wasn't willing to budge on that at all. And the federal government didn't extend any sort of additional rights to these kids or their families. And in fact, kept them in the camp. And obviously, I hope that the book is clear that I think that the camps were unnecessary, and history has proved that out.
Yes.
But, these camps were kept open for longer for political reasons beyond the war too, in terms of FDR's reelection campaign. So you had all of these different forces that were pushing on these teenagers and their decision. And that was one thing that when I was writing the book, I thought was sort of a universal thing, that especially for teenage boys, is that we've all, a lot of the readers of this book, most readers of this book will have been teenagers, and a lot of them will have been teenage boys at some point. And thinking about how I would have reacted to that situation if I had been asked to fight in this war that by a government that was keeping my family behind barbed wire and at gunpoint, I don't know what I would have done. And I think that was something that sat in my head a lot when I was thinking about the players on this football team that the book is based on, was how difficult that must have been on a daily basis to figure out what they thought was right for themselves, their family, and their country.
There's two things that come to mind when I was reading that. One was that the Japanese in Hawaii were not incarcerated. And number two, they came out with a questionnaire where you ended up having to say no or yes. And you ended up, if you said no, you were actually removed from your camp and sent to Thule, which was a place where they had even more restrictions and more guards and everything. So what about Hawaii? How come?
Yeah. That's just sort of shows the capriciousness of this whole system, where it was basically the West Coast of the United States was overseen by a different military commander than Hawaii and Alaska were. So the military commander in Hawaii understood and recognized there was no threat from these Japanese Americans in Hawaii.
Right.
And the people that were running everything on the West Coast said, oh no, we think there is. So we can, and that just shows there were no one hand wasn't talking. No one was talking to each other. And actually everyone just sort of wanted what they thought was the best way for them to handle the situation. Yeah. And on the West Coast, that meant that they were ignoring multitudes of intelligence reports, their own intelligence, and instead just deciding to sort of go along with the sort of racist whims of, like we talked about at the top, the press and certain California politicians. And yeah, getting back to the loyalty questionnaire, that was something that they instated in all of the camps in 1943. Ostensibly, it was supposed to be used to allow folks to go do to request leave camp, or to move to the East Coast, or to do seasonal work. But then it became, like you said, sort of this secondary use was to basically find who was loyal and figure out who could fight in the army and who couldn't. And again, like you said, the folks that, unbeknownst to them when they were filling this out, that they eventually, the people who were deemed, quote, unloyal or disloyal, were sent to Tule Lake, which eventually just became sort of a holding ground for all the folks that the federal government thought were a problem.
Are you familiar with someone that went to Tule from one of the camps in Arkansas, ended up being such a disruptive force at Tule? He was sent to Santa Fe, which was something that was done by the justice. Was that a prison, an actual prison with gates and guards? And
yeah,
about
the
that?
Justice Department. Yeah, the Justice Department actually. So the WRA had a certain the camps that we think about. So whether it was Manzanar or Heart Mountain or Tule or all of these sort of bigger camps, we think about the idea of Japanese internment.
Right.
Those were run by the WRA, but the Justice Department and the Army had separate camps that they held people that they considered enemy aliens. So the first people that were picked up right after Pearl Harbor. So people that had been monitored and viewed as, quote, enemy aliens at that point, which were all Japanese immigrants, first generation folks that got sent to whether it was Montana or Texas or Santa Fe. And then occasionally, I think there was some little, and also at those camps, some of those camps, there were Japanese nationals that were from South America and Central America too, that the federal government helped round up and then get sent to these US run camps, which is a whole entirely separate story that I had no room for in the book. And there's lots of other experts that know a lot more about that than me. But yeah, there were some folks who were sent from camp to camp, depending on, the Arkansas camp. The Arkansas camps were the first two to close. So you had some folks who would go from their homes to a temporary camp, to an Arkansas camp, to Heart Mountain, to Tule Lake. And back, so people that were moved 5 or 6 times in the course of only 3 or 4 years.
Yeah. We're going to have to wrap it up pretty soon. You have anything you would like to say to our audience, particularly about the book and what you hope to achieve by having exposed all this to us today?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the book, in reading some of the reviews, I think some people think that there's too much history in the book in terms of it taking away from the main narrative. And to that, I sort of think, okay, but you still read it. And some of this hopefully sank in for folks who may not be familiar with this part of US history, and not just the part about the camps, but the part about how we've treated Asian immigrants and Asian Americans in the United States from the first time that they arrived here in the mid 19th century up until today. And I think that there's a lot of unfortunate lessons in this book that are relevant today that I really wish weren't relevant. And I wish that, I didn't have to talk about how these sort of attacks on our Asian American neighbors occurring today's are just the latest part of this timeline that's existed, for 170 years. So that's my sort of takeaway from this is that I just hope that when people read this book, they walk away and think, I learned something from this that I didn't know about myself or about my history or about my country's history or, my California history,
Exactly.
whatever it may be.
And
Do you want-
I was going to
You
say,
ask them how to get the book?
tell our viewers where they can get the book.
Well, you could get it on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. I know locally in the Los Angeles area, they have it at Vroman's, and the Japanese American National Museum has a lot of copies. So you could anywhere just Google it. There's a Simon & Schuster has a page that has lots of different links to places you can buy it. But yeah, if you're interested in the LA area and want to buy it, supporting the Japanese American National Museum, who did a lot and helped the book a lot with the research, I'd be indebted for you forever if you bought it from them.
Well, thank you. You are a wonderful guest. I thank you. You've written a very important book and I loved it. And thank you for joining us this morning.
Yes, you are. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Judy,
you so much for having me.
Do you have an ending quote, Judy?
Yes, this is thinking of all the research Bradford did. This is by Neil Armstrong. Research is creating new knowledge. And haven't we gathered a lot of new knowledge from Bradford's book?
Yes, we have. And thank you very much. I'm Charlie Redner. See you next time.
I'm Judy Saxon. Thanks for watching.